Hare Krishna and welcome back to the Atma Paradigm, and we continue part 3 of our series, which is to do with life, and today our topic is life, the expression of consciousness. We'll examine how life in its many forms seems to manifest aspects that are indicative of consciousness, and we'll look at the underlying drivers which motivate all life forms. Now, as usual, we start with a quick resume of where we've reached so far. So during the past 3 weeks, we've looked at the standard ideas that are offered by biologists for the appearance, proliferation, and the variety of life forms. And these ideas tend to follow a typical evolutionary narrative that the first life self-assembles, and then over time one species becomes many with different characteristics. And these gradually and continually change over time to produce all the major classes of creatures and all the many species within them. So we considered aspects of this narrative and suggested that it may not be as sound or as complete or even as straightforward as it is presented. But this has not just been an exercise to present the flaws and the shortcomings of evolutionary theory. What we've been trying to do is to build a more consistent understanding of how life on Earth appears and thrives. So in our analysis last week of the various evolutionary ideas and approaches, we drew on a number of particular insights and points of evidence. From Lamarck, we noted how he had believed, and actually this is a now insight that has come back within biology, that certain physical traits or certain aspects that are acquired during one's life can actually indeed be passed on. And we also noted the principle of natural selection, how favorable traits may be selected and will benefit an individual to reproduce, and thus that becomes passed amongst the members of that population, of that species. The modern synthesis is the idea that actually you need mutations. Now, the same point is there, that favorable genetic changes will be passed on. Whether those changes occur by random mutations or not is something we're going to explore next week. Punctuated equilibrium, as provided by Stephen Jay Gould, kind of noted that actually we cannot assume that evolution happens on a gradual basis of accumulation of little changes, because the fossil records show that species appear suddenly and they appear fully formed. And there was other evidence that challenged the idea of gradualism. And we looked at the evo-devos, the evolutionary developmentalists, who their understanding is that there is a DNA toolkit which is common to a species group, and that what is really happening is that if there are modifications or are different uses of it within a species, it is because the DNA already exists to facilitate that type of trait. So it is not genetic mutations causing the variation. Actually, the potential for that variation already exists within the DNA toolkit of a particular species type. And I'm meaning that in a broader sense than just maybe what may be classified as an individual species. And then finally we looked at some biologists who proposed the arrow of evolution, that there's a link between information, forms, complexity, and ultimately conscious awareness. So I believe, and we're going to touch on each of these when we build on them, particularly in next week and the week after. So I believe that all these elements and evidence and insights help us to uncover the truth of the situation, but they don't necessarily support the narrative of evolutionary theory. Rather, I'm suggesting that they're calling out for a new interpretation. So where's all this leading? Well, if I seem to be down on evolution, then you might be guessing or suspecting a certain misconception of where I might be trying to lead you on this. So I'm sure that many of you have been asked by friends and family, so what do you believe in? Evolution or creation? Now, both come in their different forms. Evolution, as we saw last week, contains quite a few different processes and approaches, but all of them are sort of faithful to the core doctrine that there is descent with modification. Creation also comes in various forms, including its smart sibling, intelligent design. But each of those forms essentially proposes that God did it in some way or other. Perhaps he did it all at once, or perhaps he designed evolution as his method. So where on this binary choice does the Atma Paradigm stand? Well, actually not with either. Atma Paradigm does not align itself with evolutionary theory, nor does it fit into the category of creationism. Our approach is to formulate a philosophical framework that's consistent with scientific evidence and that is logically established and also is testable. So both creation and evolution propose a cause and a process that's beyond the scope of science and philosophy. Creation has the belief that there is a supreme creative power who did it all, and evolution requires us to have a similarly strong faith, but in the role of random natural interactions and mutations producing the variety. And that's also beyond the experimental method. So both ideas are in the same category in that respect, that they require belief in a cause and process that cannot be proven empirically. So what happens? People end up arguing over these two competing belief systems. You cannot prove either, so the arguments tend to focus on which is the more reasonable to believe in. Now, those supporting evolution argue theirs is more rational. After all, it's claimed to be based on science, and they believe they have evidential justification. But there can be no scientific evidence for its core proposition, i.e. that systems of complex information arise from low information sources and processes. So that is its core proposition. That point of the rise of complex information cannot be proven by any scientific method. Whereas creationists might counter, well, it's more rational to invoke a creator. After all, a creator would be a cause that is a source of information, and therefore we could explain complexity in that way. So they might say that's more rational. And they might further argue that since it's impossible to prove experimentally that something happens by chance, because by definition you can't interact with a non-causal abstract concept, whereas with a creator there just might be a possibility to interact with it in some way or other. Now, the Atma Paradigm isn't entering these debates. We're not interested in debates over competing beliefs. But I mention them here only to state our position that we don't require belief in looking at these questions of life, when we have in front of us, what is the third option? The Atma Paradigm, one that's based on evidence and philosophical logic, that builds from consciousness exists, it's real, it is the source of subjective experience in a way that is irreducible to physical properties. Its consciousness is therefore non-neural, not produced by the brain. It exhibits volition. It seeks to vary the content and the quality of its experiences. And consciousness is also a source of specifying information, and thereby has agency in order to affect physical systems with that information. Those are the points that we have built up and we're working on. This is an aspect of real knowledge by which we can build a better understanding of life. So now we're going to examine how these principles about consciousness apply to biological systems, particularly non-human ones. And as we do, you'll see a different picture emerging, and a picture that could be summarized as nature facilitates consciousness. Now, the first thing we must establish is the presence of consciousness in other forms of life. We touched on this a little bit in an earlier topic, but I want to give it a bit more airplay tonight. So biologists in general have ignored consciousness because by and large they leave it to the neuroscientists and the philosophers, and they've trusted them. When I speak to biologists about consciousness, they kind of just quote whatever they are being taught by the neuroscientists, that consciousness is a product of the complex brain of humans. and that it may or may not exist within higher animals. And because neuroscientists are so determined that consciousness is linked to the complex brain, if a biologist is not really dealing with a very complex brain, it doesn't think it has to take consciousness into account. So many biologists haven't carried out their work with regard to creatures being sentient psychological entities. They just treat them as things. You know, they're live, they're just live things, but not necessarily sentient. Certainly not in the way that we would think of that term. But if they had, then I think that the link between consciousness, life, and biology would be clearer than it is at the moment. But the mood is changing. And from many biologists who are involved with their interactions with living things, they're starting to challenge the old assumptions that were fed to them about animal consciousness. So this is good. But the scientific community still needs a lot of help in unraveling this subject of life and consciousness. So what do we mean by animals being sentient or conscious? In our earlier exploration of this topic, we tried to clarify a number of misconceptions and presumptions about the nature of consciousness in non-human species. Today we're going to dive right into the essential question that has to be addressed. And you'll remember this from way back in part 1, that a statement from Professor John Searle, that the essential trait of consciousness that we have to explain is unified, qualitative subjectivity. Now, you may have forgotten what we meant by all of that. But this was the challenge that is required to explain the nature of consciousness as enjoyed by us humans. And it goes like this, that we feel ourselves to be an individual existing entity. That's the unified bit. And we are the subject, the witness of the events of our life, the witness of all the thoughts and experiences within our mind. And we experience all of those events as content processed by the mind. Everything we are seeing, everything we're hearing actually has to enter the body through our senses, is processed in the brain, but ultimately it is converted by the processes of the mind and presented to us in the form of thoughts, perceptions, sensations, emotions, and so on. Sensations and emotions and impressions that we cannot reduce or cannot explain in terms of the electrical activity that the brain has. So for instance, we walk in the countryside, we admire the pretty colours of the flowers, we're feeling the pleasant warmth of the sun. Then we see the movement of a charging bull, and there's a whole new set of internal feelings, fright, panic, and leading to a big decision, run for it. So all of these forms of mental content possess qualities. Our mind represents the world to us in terms of mental imagery, a picture with the qualities of colours, forms and movements, or as a sensation, an internal emotional sensation like the quality, sensory sensation like warmth, or an emotional sensation and quality, contentedness that we were walking amongst the flowers, then fearfulness when the bull approaches. So the qualities of all those different types of mental content are called qualia. Now, these are the qualities of our inner experiences. Remember the red ball? There is something that it is like to experience its redness. Now, our challenge is to consider how best to establish that some creature, non-human creature, is not simply a responsive automaton, and it's not that it's just exhibiting some kind of expressive reaction to an environmental input, but it's actually experiencing qualia. It's not a machine with a sensor that when activated sets off an alarm. It's something which actually experiences the qualia of its vision, of its sound, of the sounds it receives, and of the emotions that it expresses. Now, it's hard enough to establish subjective, qualitative experience in other humans. So to establish that for animals and that they experience qualia is much harder, but it is possible. Now, the most common forms of qualia are related to sensory experience. There is something that is like to experience the shapes, colors and sounds, fragrances, colors, touch sensations. Those are the typical sensory qualities. And we do note that pretty well every form of life we ever examine seems to have a set of senses. They do vary from species to species type, but it tends to be a kind of emphasis of one more than another. And some may seem to have senses which are kind of extraordinary or unique. For instance, they might have sensors that pick up magnetic fields or electric fields. Turtles do the magnetic thing. Sharks have sensors for electric fields. Some can pick up infrared detection. Many birds have tetrachromacy, which means they've got 4 cones, different types of cones, and therefore, whereas we have 3 in our eyes, therefore they can see a wider range of colors that we can't even imagine. Some of them have echolocation, and some even have sensing of nutrients like amino acids. So some of those actually have now been found even within humans to a very small degree. But there is a kind of package of sensory apparatus that life seems to utilize. Now, the similarity of sensory apparatus, this kind of homology, isn't itself proof that creatures experience their inputs qualitatively. These senses might just be unconscious sensors. So maybe some inputs that we receive are dealt with subconsciously by the brain. But to suggest that all sensory input in all animals is not experienced as qualia leads to certain inconsistent logic. For instance, why are flowers colourful? Google it. And the answer you'll get is that flowers evolved their colours to attract pollinators, like bees, other insects, and also birds, to spread their seeds. So flowers are coloured, so for the evolutionary purpose, for the reproduction of it as a species. Okay, so if that's so, are you saying that the bee in our picture is experiencing colours as colours, the colourful nature, the redness of red, the pinkness of pink, as in this flower? It's a felt experience? In which case, you're saying that the bee enjoys qualitative, subjective consciousness. And if that's so, you're saying that the bee is experiencing qualia that cannot be reduced to its biology and neurology. You can't even do it for humans. You're certainly not going to be able to do it for the level of neuron activity in a bee. Oh, so now you might say, well, no. The bee simply has receptors that help the brain distinguish between the wavelengths of the light bouncing off different colored flowers. But maybe the bee doesn't qualitatively experience the colors. And the question then is, well, what is it really experiencing with the different wavelengths? Why does that make a difference to the bee? And the big one, I think, is, well, if the bee isn't experiencing the qualia of color, we know we do, but you're saying the bee doesn't. So who else does or doesn't? Are you suggesting that the only creature that can enjoy colors is the human species? That the experience of color as color, the enjoyment of redness or pinkness, is solely a human prerogative? I don't think you can have it both ways. If colors attract the bees and the birds, and they seem to, then it is logical that these creatures undergo irreducible qualitative subjective experience, which is a key indicator of phenomenal consciousness. So on that basis, bees and other creatures may be conscious entities in common with ourselves. But there's a more rigorous analysis for another group of qualia that we experience. And these are to do with internal sensations, which include fear, as I mentioned earlier, when the bull chases you, hunger, it's something you feel inside, thirst, you feel it, pain, enjoyment, excitement. There's good ones as well as bad ones. And for ease of scientific study, if or how these are experienced in animals. We're going to focus on one of them, pain. Okay? Now, human pain is defined in the medical journals as an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential damage. Okay? And a veterinary version of animal pain is described as an aversive sensory experience that elicits protective motor actions, results in learned avoidance and modifies behavior. So you can see the difference there in how we are regarding how humans experience pain as a sensory and emotional experience. Now, because they're not philosophically trained, they're using this word emotionally, they mean qualitative experience. We feel pain as painful, right? Whereas with animals, it's just a sensory experience, meaning it's a sensory input. And that input is just sets up some kind of motor activity, which is a protective motor activity. It might run away, it might lick its wound, it's something like that, and results in some kind of learned avoidance and things like that. But this is dividing human consciousness and animal consciousness. So for us, pain feels like something, but for animals, they're not admitting that it's actually felt by something. Now, I don't believe for a moment vets actually think that animals do not feel pain and that it's not important to deal with the suffering that of an animal that comes in front of them. But there's a lot more work being done on this now. And unfortunately, in the way that the scientific examinations go to check that animals have pain, they naturally have to inflict a little pain or serious discomfort on a creature. But now that that research is done, better we honor what the creatures had to go through and broadcast the results. So, I suggested the best study that has been done in this regard, and I mentioned it before, is Queen's University in Belfast in 2014, and their work on crustaceans, particularly lobsters. So they devised some very clever, testable criteria for ascertaining to a high degree of certainty. Because we're saying we can never absolutely know what another creature, even another human, is experiencing in terms of pain. So what to speak of another animal? But to a high degree of certainty, we can demonstrate that a creature is undergoing what is a felt experience of pain, pain as being painful. So their criteria, which they demonstrated for lobsters, and this is on the back of many others that they did, these are their criteria. The first is that if a creature faces noxious or other potentially painful events, that should stimulate some neurobiology and physiology in a way that is different to something which wouldn't be painful. So there must be something specifically different in the neurobiology. And that it has a change in behavior. Subsequent behavior would be modified to include avoidance of anything that would produce that sort of pain. So there's learning and protective responses. And that the animal should show a change in motivational state after experiencing a painful event. Now this is, these are kind of getting more serious as we go down the list. So this might be that the creature is making different decisions about what it will do in future. And this might include things as changing its preferred safe refuge if it associates it with something that is painful there, or changing its feeding habits if there's something that is painful. Now, the interesting thing is, some of these new choices that the animal is making in order to avoid pain make that creature more vulnerable to predators or less inclined to eat the food that might be available to it. So pain isn't an evolutionary aid teaching them to avoid predation or to maximize food and resources, as evolution was going to tell us. Pain is actually teaching these creatures to avoid pain. That's what it's doing. Pain is telling us to avoid pain wherever it comes from. It is not, so you cannot link it just to some kind of evolutionary purpose so clearly. And some creatures are able to alter their own biological processes internally to produce pain-numbing analgesics. And this effort often comes at a survival cost. There is something that that creature has to do or lose energy over in order to produce something that is pain-numbing. So that again makes it more vulnerable. So if pain has a positive use to warn creatures of damage, then it makes no sense in evolutionary terms for creatures to have developed pain-killing systems that reduce that pain and you maybe reduce the warning of damage. And we've seen that with maybe our pets. If a dog has hurt itself, hurt his legs, if you give it a little, you've got to be very careful giving painkillers to animals because they just think, all well, and off they go and run and hurt themselves again. So an analgesic is not an evolutionary benefit. So the conclusion, as reached by Queen's University and others now, is that these creatures feel pain as a painful experience, i.e. they suffer. They suffer like vertebrate animals. They suffer like we do. And to these conclusions we're going to add, they experience qualia. Because if you feel pain as a felt experience, you are feeling qualia. And if that's the case, this is the hallmark of evidence of non-neural consciousness. Therefore, we should presume that there is a non-neural source of consciousness, i.e., and we have identified that the source of that consciousness is the Atma present in these species. And perhaps because it seems to be wherever we make these sort of tests, we start to see this qualitative experience. So perhaps the Atma is present throughout all these species. Perhaps it is widespread amongst all life. So maybe this gives us a new way of considering what we mean by life. That life is the experience and expression of consciousness in a biological body. The experience and expression of consciousness in a body. So within every life form, perhaps, there is a conscious entity experiencing qualia, the qualities of the sights, the sounds and tastes, and they're experiencing this as real felt experiences, and they're experiencing those inner sensations and pain as emotional experiences. So they're experiencing qualia, but what else is going on within the inner world of the minds of these creatures? And this brings us to thinking about what animals think about. So do animals think? Now have a look at this photo. You might suggest, well, he looks like he's thinking very deeply, but maybe he's just faking it. Maybe he just looks like he has an intelligent pose and some deep wisdom behind that pose and contemplative look. Yeah, maybe. But that's also true for many human experts, philosophers and professors that we might mention. Anyway, my introduction to the question of how animals might think comes from an experience many years ago. It was my early days studying at the Theological College and ashram of Bhaktivedanta Manor. And I was given the job to help the cowherd man with the milking of the cows in the morning. And there was one cow called Haribo. She was a Jersey cow, as in this picture. And she, every morning after her milking, I had to lead her back to the field. And every day she had a completely different tactic in order to get at a pile of cabbages that were at the side of the lane. One time she went round the corner, and when she thought I couldn't see her, she just kind of shot down the lane to get to the cabbages. I chased after her and managed to kind of chase her on. The next day, she walked straight past the cabbages as if nothing interested her at all. Went down another 20 yards or so, got to the gate. At the gate, she turned around to look at me, and as if to say, well, are you going to open this or not? So I went past her, opened the gate, and as I was doing that, she shot up back the lane to get the cabbages. So we may all have many of these kind of apocryphal stories, because I think anyone who works with animals or has pets at home suspect or maybe are really convinced that these creatures are perceptive, they're calculating, they're communicative, and they've all got their own personality traits. But, as we said before, it's a tricky area getting inside the mind of other creatures. And I heard an interview some time ago with one zoologist who explained this kind of conundrum, that he said, we've got to be careful. We shouldn't over-anthropomorphize, or i.e. we shouldn't just assign human personality traits to behavior and things that we see. Because if we do, we could be imagining stuff, we could be delusional. But, he said, if we don't anthropomorphize to some extent, we'll never understand what these creatures are up to. There is something going on that has a similarity to our own way of thinking. So that's the good advice. So we're going to proceed with caution, and we're going to look at evidence that has arisen from clinical studies. However, the presumption against the thinking ability of animals arises from certain key misconceptions, which I'll cover as we go along. And one of them is language. Most of our own thoughts seem to be in the form of words. We hear them in our minds as language, so our assumption is, how can animals be able to think without language? So, and as long as this language was considered to be a kind of hallmark of consciousness, because if you think language is needed for cognition and cognition is needed for consciousness, if you've got no language, you've got no cognition, you've got no consciousness. So under that presumption, the challenge was that animals don't have language, can't think, they're not conscious. But we can't actually claim that animals do not use or understand language. Nature has equipped many of them with facilities for communicating with sounds and gestures. And I'm just going to, one example, one of the most advanced uses of language has been studied in prairie dogs, which are actually a kind of ground squirrel. Now, they use different sounds for different threats. Hawk, human, coyote, dog. Many creatures, even dogs, tend to use nouns or what may seem to be action words. But prairie dogs are known now to use adjectives. One experiment they did had 4 identical humans circling near the prairie dogs, but and they were wearing similar shirts, but of different colours. And what they found is that the colony devised and used different chirps to denote the differently clad humans. Watch out for the yellow-coloured human, here comes the red-coloured one. And they even showed that the colony could devise new chirps to describe the features of objects that they had never seen before. Now that's quite a bit of sophistication. But actually not all thinking has to be language or pattern based. At a conference on consciousness some 4 years ago, I put this challenge of language to an animal psychologist working at the Bristol University. And she explained that the new evidence in stroke patients has actually changed how we think about thinking. Because some of these patients lose access to Broca's region, which means that they're not able to process language. And what these patients explained is that whilst that was happening, they would no longer think in language terms. Their thoughts were no longer language-based. But they weren't just sitting there like vegetables. They felt they had a full life of thoughts. They just weren't word-based. Now, that may be hard for us to appreciate without having to go through that kind of trauma. But animal psychologists are kind of using this to understand that animals can happily process quite complex concepts without language, or whether it is not needed or not. So here's a few fun examples of complex thinking in various creatures. One of the tests that people do is the mirror test to see whether animals can recognize themselves in a mirror. Now, part of the difficulty, I think, for animals is that they've never seen something reflective, which is vertical. You know, they might have looked in the water, but not usually at something vertical. Now, a human child between 2 and 3 will be able to recognize itself. For other animals, what you normally do is introduce a mark, say a red dot on their forehead, and see if the creature tries to remove it. So far, only a few species types seem to pass this. some primates. Elephants do, dolphins and crows are the main ones. And but there are many other ways that we can see whether animals show that they are thinking complex stuff. Theory of mind involves an individual, whether human or animal, having an understanding that another creature has a mind and how that mind might be thinking. So crows are a good example of this one. For instance, if a crow is burying some of its stashed food and it sees another crow and it thinks that crow has seen where I'm stashing the food, that crow will know where my food is. So what they do is they dig it up and relocate it when no other crow is watching. It means that they understand that the other crow is a thinking thing and knows where the food is buried and may wish to take it for themselves. So this is clever. Crows also have been shown to use tools, and there's some very interesting kind of little video clips of water displacement tests showing that they're inventive and very intelligent in how they apply themselves to a particular task to get some food out of a tube of water. So they also, I remember one description I was given at a conference, how they plan for the future. They know that if they get some food at a particular time and tomorrow they're not necessarily going to get that food, they know where to put it and where they will be tomorrow so that they get their breakfast. Quite clever. Cichlids are little fighting fish, and they're always having little one-to-one battles. And what's been found is that they're able to rate each other's ability simply by observation, not necessarily by being part of a fight. So a test was set up with one of the fish as an observer in one section of the tank. In another section of the tank, there was one-on-one fights between 5 other cichlids, duels between 2 of them in sequence. And the various fights established a hierarchy of fighting ability of these 5. A was the best and E was the weakest. Later on, when the observer was in a situation where it was a 3-part tank, the observer was in the middle, and on one side was the A in its section, and on the other section was the E. The cichlid knew that A is the more aggressive, nastier one. He stuck next to the E. B and D, he stuck next to the D. So he understood the nature of that sort of rating. And of course, we talked about Nikisi, the psychic parrot, who was the star of our talk 2.5. And this helps us appreciate the ability of a creature to acquire information from the mind of a human, even though separated and without any chance of physical communication. So, how far down the tree of life does consciousness go? I remember discussing this with a group including Sir Roger Penrose at Oxford, and because he'd written that he suspected consciousness to be present in animals, just wasn't sure how far down the animal ladder it went. And when we raised the study of consciousness in plants, and that there has now quite a bit of studies, which I'm going to come on to, he wondered, well, what will the vegetarians think of that? Now, it's been difficult enough for people to appreciate how animals are sentient and conscious beings, but it's been even more difficult to have people accept that plants may be sentient. And the reason is they don't seem to have a neural system like animals do. Now, one of the pioneers in plant physiology and neurobiology was Jagdish Chandra Bose, and he was the founder of the laboratory where Prabhupada worked. He was an eminent physicist. He was the guy who showed how to produce wireless waves, radio waves. And by doing that, Marconi was able then to invent the radio and credited Bose for his work. So very eminent. But then he decided, I'm going to study plants. So he looked at the effect of these radio waves on plants. And after years of studying and devising all sorts of incredible experiments and even new devices in order to measure the effects that he was seeing, here was his conclusions. That plants have an electromechanical pulse. They have a nervous system. And they have a form of intelligence capable of learning and remembering. Now this was revolutionary 100 years ago. Later in life he kind of spoke more freely. He said, these trees have a life like ours. They eat and grow. They face poverty, sorrows and sufferings. And this poverty may induce them to steal and rob. But they also help each other, develop friendships, and sacrifice their lives for their children. Talking about trees 100 years ago? It's only now that the West and its biology has caught up with Bosch. These key observations have now been verified. And many are now accepting that even without animal-type neurons, plants show similar traits linked to intelligence and consciousness. It's now clear that plants communicate with each other and consider the needs of their offspring and others of their kind, and they'll supply nutrients to an ailing plant nearby. Now, one study that was done in Sydney University involved the Mimosa pudica plant, which is known to be highly sensitive to touch. You can see in the picture how just the finger and the fern leaves seem to be kind of bending back in. This is what the mimosa does under threat. Now, what they did was they tried some experiments dropping it. And they found by dropping it onto foam, at first the mimosa plant thought this is not meant to happen. Plants don't usually go through a kind of vertical drop under natural circumstances, so they would curl. But then when they realized actually it wasn't a major deal, they just dropped a little bit and they had a soft landing, they stopped curling. And even a month later they were able to repeat the experiment and the mimosa was no longer curling for the drop. So what they found is that this matched what they call the habituation effects that you see in animals. And another study in 2019, just came out last year from the Middle East, scientists were working with tobacco and tomato plants, and they demonstrated that they let out high frequency distress sounds when they're cut or when they're deprived of water, and that these sounds were louder and 25 times more often than plants under normal conditions. And they could correlate these screams, if I'm not being pejorative, these cries with the stress that the plant was under. Now, that alone doesn't tell us that plants feel pain as painful. What we need is the type of experiment that Queen's University did on the lobsters. We need to kind of show a few other aspects. But this is, at least it's in the right direction, and more experiments can be done on this. And it's interesting that way back in 1908, Charles Darwin gave a talk in Dublin and said, it is consistent with the doctrine of continuity, i.e. evolution, that in all living things there is something psychic. And if we accept this point of view, we must believe that in plants there exists a faint copy of what we know as consciousness in ourselves. Now, this is part of the motivation that is used by biologists in order to explore consciousness in animals and plants. I think they've got two things. One is it's a way of having a dig at creationists, I'm afraid, because they're trying to show that humans are not that special. They're not that kind of special creation different from the beasts, that there is a kind of commonality of thinking and consciousness. And secondly, that they have to try and demonstrate where consciousness in humans comes from, and the only way is to say, well, all our thinking, all our attitudes must arise from what is going on in plants and animals. Now, that's at least that is getting them to study it. However, if you can't explain the nature of consciousness in humans, as we've talked about rather extensively, then how are you going to do it with animals and with plants? So maybe that is not the connection between them. And there's another interesting aspect that I picked up in studying this, that if you look at topics looking at the consciousness in plants, you'll find that opposition to the idea that plants have conscious and that they feel pain is being promoted by various folk linked to animal welfare groups and the vegan community, because it seems they don't want to sully the issue that eating plants causes no pain as compared to animals. Now there is a difference, of course, and that's worth studying, but it's not that animals can be said not to feel pain. So animal and plants experience qualitatively. They aren't machines with sensors just responding mechanically. When they see something, they experience it with qualia. Forms and colours, noises sound like something to them, sensations are felt. Damage to their body isn't just a neural signal, it feels painful. And we've seen that they express intention. This is shown in their ability to think, to plan, calculate, to learn, to remember, and also their ability to communicate their knowledge and emotions to others, whether it's verbally or in gestures. So these two characteristics, experiencing and expressing intention, are features of the same type of individual subjective consciousness that we explored for humans in the early talks of this series. So this should help us to move away from the idea that they are just dumb beasts or just dumb plants. But the question is, do they share also some of the same drives and motivations as humans? So let's now look at how life behaves. There are basically two types of animal faculties. There's senses, the stuff that they use for sensory perception, all sorts of organs that help them interact and gain information about the world around them. Now, we can only guess to the extent of what they perceive through some of their amazing senses. What is it like for the ears of a bat to pick up high frequency vibrations? What does it sound like to them? What are the intense smells that a dog seems to enjoy? Why do they like them? So these abilities for perception indicate that these creatures experience qualia and therefore something that is explained according to the functions of consciousness. But another type of animal behavior involves the faculties that they have for action and manipulation. So here's some examples when they're under challenge: fight or flight, or use every last breath to get back in the water for the fish. Now, are these actions simply mechanical or intentional? Is there a will at work? Are they trying to fulfill a particular motivation of the creature? And besides these life and death situations, or perhaps, animals use their faculties in another way. And I'm going to put these in the category of leisure. Of course, wings of a bird, very useful, but also highly enjoyable. I watch, I've talked about the doves near me, going for their kind of social fly around, which doesn't seem to have any kind of benefit other than to stretch their wings and then kind of enjoy themselves flying together. We watch the young lambs in the field, at an early age, exploring what they can do with their legs, bouncing around, enjoying themselves. And we see youngsters playing like these elephants. Now, are they simply learning the survival skills they will need as adults? Are they enjoying themselves simply because enjoyment is a sufficient purpose in itself? And here's a pod of dolphins just leaping out of the water, showing off maybe, some form of communication, or just having fun. I remember seeing one clip of dolphins where they had a clump of seaweed and they were throwing it from one to the other, as if playing a game of catch as they swam along. Now, are we reading too much into this behavior? Or perhaps we are reading too little? So I'm going to show you a little clip now. I'm going to knock myself off for a second. And then I'm going to show you a clip which I hope will be helpful, because it starts to show us what sort of things may be going on in the mind of these animals. Let me just turn that on now for you. First of all, one is a little more difficult. This is a water buffalo, and you can see the fear in its eyes as this particular lion is sinking its teeth into its back. The others are watching on thinking, let's see how this goes. This looks like fun. But somehow or other, the water buffalo gets away. This is an orca, killer whale, and her calf has died. And for 3 weeks, naturalists watch her carry the dead calf, the body of the calf, with her over all this time. And this is considered to be an act of grieving. And here's a crow. he's found some rubber thing or some plastic thing, and he's using it as a skateboard down, snowboarding rather, down the ramp. And he just kept on doing that. He thought, this is great fun. This is Christian the lion, released into the wild, ahead of his pride, but a couple of years later met up with the two lads who knew him in London. And we can just kind of see the fun that they had. I just want to mention that because I did a piece on BBC Radio some years ago about that, Christian the lion, and the way that the lion actually expressed affection for these humans, even though he was living out in the wild and killing other creatures for food at the head of his pride. However, and from that, I actually had a really lovely letter from Virginia McKenna, who played Joy Adamson in the old film Born Free, talking about, giving some more information of when she used to interact with Christian the lion when he was living in London. Now, here we have a polar bear. Polar bears get hungry, and if they see a husky, they would often come and try and eat them. But sometimes it's just lonely, and some of the polar bears seem to want to make friends with the huskies, get to know them, and keep on returning back to see them. And this dog's got lost, but his friend managed to grab the stick and pull him out. Pretty smart. There's a dog here. She found a young deer in the water and has rescued it and pulled it in. So they're not related genetically, but the dog is eager to try and encourage this little fawn back into life. Here's a cat rescuing a fish. There it goes. Very nice. And a bear rescues this poor crow, it looks like. Job done. And shakes itself off. But look at this. How does the dog know that fish actually need water to survive? That's interesting thinking. And more than that, it's powerful empathy. This zebra has been attacked by a crocodile, but the hippos don't like that. They'll protect it. But not all animals are altruistic. They can be mean just for the fun of it. But that's the point. They want to have fun. So this all begs us to consider, what is the underlying motivation that drives life? Well, evolutionists will say it's very simple. It's survival. Now, certainly survival is important. In Britain, we've got David Attenborough. He's a national treasure, and I've got a huge respect for him. But on one nature documentary, he was describing the migration of the wildebeest in South Africa. And he made this statement, that for these animals, survival is a matter of life and death. Now, no one's going to say that survival isn't important, but to say that survival is a matter of life and death is starting to kind of think that you're using survival as some kind of deity, some kind of force of nature. It's not like that, you know? So, of course, all life wants to perpetuate its existence within this body. But is that the only thing that's going on? Is survival the sole motivating factor for life? Now, the physical narrative needs it to be like that, because they believe that they might have some reason to assume that a chemically based biological system would want to perpetuate its existence. I'm not sure that's logical. I'm not sure that follows, but that is the principle, that maybe things want to survive. But to soften this notion of survival, a second motivating factor is added, and that is the idea of passing on our genes, wanting to see our genes passed on. And of course, that was the basis of the selfish gene, in Richard Dawkins. So again, this is meant to be a driver that has its origins in inert chemical processes. So the idea is that evolutionary psychology tries to reduce all life behavior and motivation down to these two factors. And I'm afraid I think that results in a kind of twisted interpretation, not just of animal life, but also of human nature, because the same factors are being used to analyze human activity. And this diminishes the value of life, including our own. And it denies all the higher aspirations that we cherish as human values. And the only reason for doing that is because you're trying to promote a doctrine that life is simply matter. But that's a terrible price to pay for society, terrible price for society to pay just for the sake of promoting a doctrine. So this idea that survival and passing on our genes as the sole primary motivators, that doesn't seem to work. And look, if we were all together, I'd ask you to come up with what other motivating factors do you believe is there in life. First, we'll ask that question for humans. All right? What are the other motivating factors that seem to drive human life? Here's some that we did earlier. Got all these different ones popped up. Yes, survival and passing on, we've still got them there. But also we have a sense of connection, freedom, novelty, ideology, experience, love, curiosity, pleasure, independence, affection, knowledge, and belief. In no particular order, they just were splattered on the board. Now, we want to investigate in terms of human nature, are all these other motivations 100% dependent on the first two, survival and reproduction? Or which of these, of all of these, can be considered primary motivating factors for humans? I think the best way to deal with this is to ask, which ones might a human sacrifice their life for? I.e., which ones would a human prefer not to live if it meant giving up one of these? And you can start to have a whole analysis of this. And we don't really have time to do it in great detail. But we know people will fight for their freedom, even at the risk of their life. They will risk their life for adventure. They will certainly risk their life for their family, for love, for connections with their family. We know that they will sacrifice and give up life if it means that there's no hope of pleasure. So all of these actually seem to be motivators that we would sacrifice survival for. That's the point. So there may be some that I wouldn't sacrifice myself for, I suppose. And I remember no joke on that one. But they might be a sufficient cause for another person to do. So all of them are motivating factors. Now, are these motivating factors that would get us to give up life? Sacrificing ourselves for saving someone we loved? Is that a glitch on the norm? Or is that an indication that all of these motivations make up the norm? That's the point we're making. That these aren't glitches. These aren't things which are somehow a kind of contrary to survival thing that just happens to in occasions. No, all of these motivations make up the norm for what it is to be human. But what about animals? Which of these do not apply to them? Well, probably we'll knock off ideology and belief, because we don't reckon that many animals have a political or philosophical ideology or some religious belief system that would figure highly on their reason to sacrifice their life. So we'll knock those off, right? But what about all the others? My contention is that all of them stay on the list. We can see that there are examples where animals will sacrifice and act against their survival tendency, act against their reproductive ability, if it means they might sacrifice one of these other things. So they will sacrifice themselves for freedom. They will sacrifice themselves for friendship. They will sacrifice themselves for their offspring. They will sacrifice themselves for others in their group. They will sacrifice themselves from misadventure, trying to discover something new, novel, and getting into trouble. All of these drives within life are directly related to consciousness. And they indicate the primary interests of the experience and expression of consciousness. So, first of all, there is motivations that life shows in relationship to pleasure. Life wants to enjoy, to be happy, to be free, to do what it wants, to get the gratification that it wants. And often that enjoyment entails feeling the connection with other creatures, usually of its own species, of its own family perhaps. Oh, sorry, 1 second. Oh, and to feel connection and to form family and social views. Oh, I think that's because I disappeared from view here. Apologies. Should have come back a little earlier. So often that enjoyment involves their connection with other creatures. They want to form relationships. They want to express affection and love and caring. And as well as that, they also have surviving. Yes, now survival is important. Why? Because we want to preserve and extend our enjoyment. Survival is secondary to enjoyment. It's necessary for enjoyment. That's why survival is important. So some of our motivations are linked to existence. We want our existence to perpetuate, and possibly we want to see ourselves perpetuated as humans. Of course, we want to create statues and make our mark in the world, but we also do it by producing offspring. And there's a third category of life drivers, which are related to knowledge. We want knowledge, we want to gain our understanding of the world, because that helps us as humans, and it also helps other creatures enjoy, helps it survive to enjoy. So information helps life express its will to vary and enhance what it experiences. So ultimately, existence and knowledge are servants of the motivation that we want to enjoy. And if you remember, this is one of Jiva Goswami's original kind of intuitions, that as well as existing, we exist to seek pleasure. So we can connect each of these drivers back to what we defined as the primary psychology of the consciousness of the Atma. And that we have defined as the Atma is the individualized unit of the field of consciousness, the smallest entity possessing the property of subjective awareness and volition. And these three features of the Atma are referred to as Sat, Chit, and Ananda. Sat, as it relates to the Atma's nature, as non-temporal, outside and unaffected by time, ever existing. Chit, as it relates to the Atma's nature, as a sentient, aware, conscious entity. Ananda, as it relates to an Atma's nature to be pleasureful and to express feelings of love and affection. These factors represent the underlying inherent nature of the Atma. And when the Atma is present within a biological body, these interests manifest to a partial or small extent. They're not manifest fully, as in full consciousness, but they do manifest. They seep through. They are not non-existent. Every life will express its need for pleasure, for existing, for enjoying what it tries to do. It will show that it wants to exist in order to enjoy, and it will actually seek some information to make that more possible and more pleasurable. So life is the interplay of the Atma and a biological body. And what we're seeing is that whatever that body is, the Atma is present within it. So this outlook leads us to propose the body as a sort of vehicle for the Atma, a biological system accommodating and facilitating the interests of consciousness. Now I'm just going to take a few minutes to deal with a question that might arise from this. Is this a sort of vitalism that the Atma Paradigm is trying to present? And the answer to that is, well, yes, maybe, sort of, but really no. Actually, no. Let me explain. Different definitions for what we mean by vitalism. The chemistry version is that only life can produce organic chemicals, or that organic chemicals cannot be artificially synthesized. Now, the Atma Paradigm isn't really claiming something so naive. When we say that complex biological systems may not have arisen from purely inorganic processes, we're making the point that the information content of such a system requires a scientific explanation, not just blind reliance on chance chemical interactions. And we are making that claim because we know there is an information supplying agent available connected with living organisms, i.e. the Atma, the conscious Atma within the body. Now, interestingly, on this point of life and chemistry, you may have picked up on the news this week that the scientific community is buzzing with the discovery of a particular gas in the atmosphere of Venus. This is phosphine. And why? Because phosphine, no one knows how you would produce phosphine on Venus other than if it was done by living beings, such as some kind of extremophile bacteria. Now, they may well discover another thing, but at the moment, that's got them on a buzz. So the chemistry definition for vitalism isn't really that helpful. But another version of vitalism defines it as the idea that living things contain some non-physical element. Now, that might seem to apply what I'm just saying in terms of the Atma Paradigm. However, the vitalist label is more applicable to theories that propose some vague idea of what Henry Bergson called the élan vital, the life force. And Julian Huxley dismissed this élan vital as useless because it had no more explanatory power than saying the ability of a train is because of its amazing train power. Now, I agree that just invoking some kind of life force, is not a proper explanation. It doesn't have serious explanatory power. But and some vague vitalist ideas do fall in that category. And I think also theories which invoke chance as causal also fall into this vague category. Neither are explanatory. However, we've already demonstrated that consciousness is real. It exists, and it's not a physical property. So the reality of consciousness already takes us into that non-physical or beyond the physical reductive situation. We're exploring the interaction of consciousness with another aspect of reality, the physical world. So being labeled vitalism is not appropriate for the Atma Paradigm. Vitalism is meant to be a put down. It's meant to infer kind of old-fashioned medieval religious ideas. However, for those studying consciousness, this idea of calling something vitalism is outmoded because the lines are now blurred between what we know exists in terms of consciousness and what we can explain by current physics. And we are told, as we discussed many talks ago, that we need a bigger idea of what matter and physics might be. So using the term vitalism, whether as an insult or a categorization, just indicates one's own preconceptions, prejudices, and frankly, a failure to keep up with the times. The use of labels that kind of seek to ostracize a particular idea, simply this conflicts with scientific integrity. We are meant to travel where the evidence leads us. And this is why I believe the Atma Paradigm deserves to be regarded on its own merits without trying to put it into some other inappropriate box. So, we've run a little over, but I'll just make a few final kind of comments. So, at least the door to research into animal and plant consciousness is starting to open up, and we'll expect a lot more of this. Many biologists now have strong motivation to identify the traits of intelligence and consciousness in both animals and plants. And I mentioned that for a lot of them, it's been trying to show the evolutionary roots of particular traits. Now, we agree that many of the traits that we see in humans are exhibited in other species. But that sort of commonality of consciousness, intention, motivation is not the result of biological evolution. It's because that in each life form, there is the presence of an individual Atma. Each Atma is a unit of consciousness, and all Atmas share the same underlying characteristics, the drivers of existence, knowledge, and pleasure, which feed into their life, whatever their body is. So these traits of a creature's psychology, its cognition, and its behavior can really only be understood in terms of conscious experience and expression. And if a physicalist theory of life cannot account for the existence of consciousness in humans, never mind animals or plants, then any pronouncement it might make where these traits arise can't be considered to be coherent or comprehensive. Now, when we say that there is commonality of the presence of the Atma in all life forms, we don't mean that when embodied, all life exhibits the same level of conscious expression or awareness. We're not saying that they have the same level of consciousness. There's certainly a degree of gradation of awareness, comprehension, learning, expression, intelligence, etc. amongst different species types. However, today we're concentrating on what is the commonality, and the differences that they may exist between them shouldn't blind us to the observation that all life seems to share common motivations to perpetuate its existence, to learn, to enhance our circumstances, and to maximize our favorable experiences whilst in our current body. And those are important because when you equip yourself with that realization, then you're able to have a new, fresh look at biology. And in next week's talk, we're going to show how these motivations really have potency. They dramatically affect the workings of our own bodies and genes. That talk we will call How Psychology Drives Biology. But I'm going to finish just on this topic with the story of the sage chatting with his cat. The sage was realized in this understanding of consciousness, and he explained to the cat that in all bodies there was the same source of consciousness, the Atma. So says the sage to the cat, this means that in the ultimate issue, you and I are equal. The cat just looks at him with disdain and replies, nah, not even close. We don't have time for questions today, and actually we'd rather do the questions submitted by email. So we've got an email address, info@spi.org. It's on the website. It should be on both Facebook and YouTube. Please write in if you've got questions relating to the particular subject matter that we have. Otherwise, we're going to see you next week for 3.6, which is Psychology Drives Biology.